Thank you. So for the first part of this workshop, I'll kind of be explaining why why we looked at the bread mold scenario, and then how we incorporated with the microbit, and then hopefully we can do some coding together using the microbit. So the bread mold and microbits was an interesting topic. The reason we chose this is because we were looking at creating a student incursion for stage 3 students. Now, stage 3 students for us is years 5 and 6. And year 5 and 6 often start their science journey with looking at bread and growing mold, and that's their first science experiment that they do all by themselves. So we thought we would make it a little bit more technical by adding the microbits. Now, before I get fully into what we're doing, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we're all meeting today. And I acknowledge the role of elders past, present, future, and the importance of observing the cultures, customs, and traditions of the Aboriginal people of Australia whose land I'm on at the moment, which is the Wiradjuri people. Now, when we talk about mold, we looked at why mold is so important in the environment. And if you're looking at anything really that most people would have access to, it's bread. So bread kind of played a daily part of all of our students' lives. And we actually did this right before the holidays as a way to help parents out with knowing the kids needed to clean their lunchboxes out. So mold, really important part of biodegradability, and it's something that all students knew about and could understand what they were talking about and measuring. If you wanted to have a look at the science experiment report that we used, you can use your QR code. There's a short link there. I have made it public to everyone. So yeah, have a look at it. We had the students write the experiment up in a formal way because we were really looking at the variables that they were using. So we wanted to make sure that when they were completing their bread mold microbit experiment, that they looked at what the controlled variables were, things that they kept the same, things that they didn't change during that experiment. We really wanted to make sure that they understood the difference between the dependent variable, so the effect, and the independent variable, which was the cause. And often teachers in our primary area complete experiments, but do not explain the 3 variables. It's not until high school that you actually start looking at those variables. So we were starting to bring in something that the students hadn't done before. We were also looking at what it took to create a valid experiment. So making sure that what we were testing actually tested what we were testing, and what we were measuring was actually what we were trying to measure. Because depending on where the students were putting their items, it got to a lot of discussion about fair tests and controlled variables. So if I was putting 3 different pieces of bread in 3 different areas, how can I actually compare those results if I've used 3 different brands of bread in 3 different areas. There's no correlation. So it was going right back to the start of looking at what those things are that are staying constant throughout the whole experiment. Now, I did this with a group of digital leaders just like me, and there were 4 of us. So we did the experiment 4 different ways, just to show that there were so many different possibilities. So one of the leaders looked at types of bread. So do different types of grain affect the rate of mold growth? And they left their experiment for a week to have a look at the mold. Now, you'll notice that all of the pieces of bread were placed in plastic bags with a grid. So we thought that we could count the grid squares out to be able to look at the amount of mold. But with by having it in the Ziploc bags and making sure the Ziploc bags were never opened, then we kind of reduced the risk of inhaling any spores. So we had our controlled variables, which were the temperature and the light. So the pieces of bread were all in the same place, but they were all different types of bread. The next one we had looking at temperature. So we had one of the leaders put their bread in 3 different places. So one was outside in the sun under a bucket. Now, the reason for that was because we didn't want the light to have any effect. We had one in the freezer and one in the pantry in the dark. And the pantry one was put into a brown paper bag and placed at the back of the pantry so that it was still dark. Now, a different one was testing the light level. So again, we had the bread in the same place, and you'll notice that we use cellophane to be able to change the color of the light, and that actually then changed with the microbit the the light number that we received. Now, when we were looking at using this with the microbit, we realized that we had to kind of work out the best way to put the microbit so that we could measure the light without actually having to throw the microbit out if we put it inside the Ziploc bag. So that's why the cellophane is actually wrapped on top of the plastic bag so that we could keep the microbit away from the mold itself, but also so that we could collect the data of the light continuously. Oh, sorry. And then we come to the last type of experiment that we were looking at, which was moisture. So we put different lots of water onto the bread, let it soak up, and then use the microbit as a moisture tester. And then placed all of those pieces of bread into the bucket upside down so that they were all in the same temperature and light, but that they all had different types, different amounts of moisture that was measured beforehand. So you can see that the bread was measured and then placed into the Ziploc bag as soon as the moisture content was measured. And we used the soil moisture tutorial for this one from the Microbit Foundation. Nice and easy, but instead of looking at soil, we just used our 2 nails to look at the conductivity in bread, placing the nails the same distance apart. And so these were 3 different ways that we could show the students 4 different ways that we could show the students how they could do an experiment like this, but we didn't want to give them the answer exactly of you have to do it this way. So this was what we thought would be the best way to show them how to do an open-ended experiment and let them have a go at doing it themselves. So we then brought in what was the microbit and explained, once they got the idea of what the moldy bread experiment was and how it was going to work, what was the microbit, how it could work. We looked at basic visual coding, so looking at just putting symbols, numbers, whatever on to the front of their microbit. And then we went into make code, and now is time for our demonstration. So I'm going to quickly stop sharing and then share my other screen. So let's share this screen. Now, I apologize if anyone has any questions, please throw them into the chat. Okay, so in make code, when we were looking at different experiments, we could obviously measure different variables. So we've been playing around with them. So to start off with, we looked at just light. So initially just having the bar graph of the light, and the reason why we put up the 255 was so that when we were playing with the simulator, then it at 255, that's full light, full sun. For students that were working from home, they didn't actually get to use the microbit during their experiment, but they did get to complete the simulator part and create a code for their work. So we had a forever block. We were initially just using the plot the graph up to the light, talking about putting some pauses in. So the pauses would allow us then to allow the battery pack to last a bit longer, because we weren't sure how long the batteries were going to last, and we weren't sure, depending on the temperature and the places that the students were putting the bread, how long it would take for the experiment to actually occur. So for most of us leaders, it was taking about a week, and depending on whether they'd used the batteries before, it was just something that they had to watch if they were trying to record continuous data. So if the students were just doing their testing of their coding, they were using the simulator, they were checking out their graphs on the front of their microbit just by moving the sun around. Now, what we got them to do was to show the console as well. So the console then allowed them to see their experiment in real time graphing. So you could change the level of light and the graph would then move up and down. And if they wanted to, they could export this into Excel so that they had a graph that they could then analyze later. So if they had their sensors on with their microbit, they could make sure that they were measuring the light level if that was something that they were testing that was going to be a variable that was changing. If it was temperature, they could be measuring their temperature. And as you saw before, if they completed the moisture level, then they for the moisture level. They actually followed the moisture level tutorial, but it was completed before they put their bread out. So this is an example of what a student could have used to measure their moisture level. So they lowered the brightness so that they could conserve their energy. They used the voltage on their pin so that they had a voltage between 0 and 1023. So 0 means that there was no current whatsoever. So that would be the really dry bread. And 1023 was the maximum current, which meant that the bread was really, really, really wet. One issue that we had with this was that we had to look at different types of bread, because different types of bread have different levels of salt and different levels of water themselves, and that different level of moisture content and where you actually cut the slice of bread from. So if you took the end slices of bread, their initial reading before the moisture was placed on them at all was actually a lot drier or a lot less than the pieces of bread in the center. So that was a little bit of an interesting learning curve. But they got to measure that moisture content. We gave them little hints. So like this red line here, which is the set reading to analog pin. Lots of students weren't sure where to find it because there are two red colors. So we then kind of gave hints about explaining and creating variables and then putting our variables into our work. Now, again, that pause will allow to conserve the battery, but also moisture level didn't change regularly. So when the pause was added, it was because we're collecting the moisture level once, but we wanted to kind of have a couple of readings. So just to make sure the moisture didn't change too much. Or that if we put the nails in different places in the bread, that we weren't just kind of looking at one moisture place within the bread. We wanted to try them at both corners, just to make sure. Now, so we looked at the moisture. When we were looking at graphing our light, we had a couple of different ways that students graphed them. So initially, students were looking at just plotting the bar graph of the light levels, and we showed you that, and I showed you that just before. But the second way was using the serial write value as well. So they would look at the serial write value, have the number playing across the front of the microbit, but also collecting the data as the serial write value. Now, normally when you plug a microbit into your computer and you've got the serial write value, an extra display will pop up here, and it will be show the device display. Now, unfortunately, that show the display isn't popping up for me this morning. So we'll just use the console simulator, but again, they could collect their temperature readings as a graph, be able to look at the highs and lows, and then export the data. So for this one, when they were looking at temperature, some of the groups of students would look at maintaining the same temperature the whole time. And then others were looking at how the temperature changed during the day. So where with the experiment in the pantry, where we had the 3 different temperatures in the fridge and in the pantry, the temperature stayed quite consistent there. But in the sun outside, in the bucket, the temperature did fluctuate. So that was something that the students could then write about in their experiment report, as a way of not being able to maintain those constant variables. Okay. So we've looked at graphing the light, we looked at the moisture, we looked at the serial write lines for temperature. Then we got to the harder part, which would be creating the radio receiver and creating the radio transmitter. Sorry. So for this one, we looked at how we could set up the radio. So again, you can go into the radio games to have a little play first, but setting that radio group up so that both groups of microbits, so for this one you would need 2 microbits, and have one set up as the receiver and then one set up as the transmitter. So when there were multiple groups in the class, just changing that set group and giving each group a number so that the information didn't get confused between the different microbit groups was very handy. Also then using the serial write values, and students again weren't sure where to find them, so we were just letting them know that you would go into the advanced, into serial to find those right numbers and right values. And then once the radio information has been received, having the name and the value as those options. So that's one part of our, did I click this one? And so that was the receiver for this one, the transmitter, making sure that group number was set at group number 1, and then having in the forever loop the radio send value as temperature and light levels. So we could send information really simply and quickly to a computer inside. Now, one of the extension parts, if you wanted to go further, could be adding in to the advanced model so that you can collect in Excel data streamer. So some groups wanted to have data streamer running, and data streamer is just an add-on in Excel where you can connect your device, start your data running, complete some screen captures, and then stop the recording. And it was just another way to capture the data. For some groups, they'd used this before the update to microbit, where you could find the streamer and have it being graphed in this section. So they kind of knew what they were doing, so they wanted to go further. But for most groups, the microbit simulator was just perfect and nice and easy to use. So, sorry, I'll stop sharing. So with the microbit, you can see there was lots of different ways that you could incorporate the microbit into your experiment. There are lots of ways that we completed the experiment because we did really want it as individual as possible, and still using the visual programming for students so that it was more of the science that they were focused on rather than the coding part, because it was coming out of like a science lesson rather than a tech lesson, but still getting to incorporate coding and learning about computational thinking in terms of a science experiment. Excellent. So,
Tanya, thank you so much. I don't mean to jump in if you were about to share something else, but it sounded like you were wrapping up.
yeah, I kind of left some time for questions, if anybody had any questions.
Yeah, make that invitation out for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely use the moisture level in the soil. The microbit foundation soil moisture like lesson plan is what we used for the bread, but yeah, definitely use it for soil. Just one thing that we noticed is different nails gave different values. So you just kind of need to make sure that you use the same one so that you get a comparison, if that makes sense.
One question I have, Tanya, for the a lot of the lesson plans and the resources that you shared, is there a best place, or is there a place that people can look at those and remix or use the examples that you shared? Where can we go to find that?
Yes and no. So all the examples that all of the pieces of code that we'd used with all the visual programming all came from the microbit lessons. So I'll just pull that one up. So they were just microbit online lessons for the foundation. So we're using the microbit classroom for a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did share the QR code for our experiment. But if anybody wanted more information, just send a message out and I can send you what we've done. We did video the webinar that we ran for teachers and students. So we can, share that as well if people wanted.
Okay, so people should just reach out to you directly for questions. Do you want to maybe drop your email into the chat as Nakima has suggested as well? That way we can follow up with inquiries. Excellent.
So that's my email. But yeah, just looking at ways that you can incorporate microbits into things that students are already using. So students always used the moldy bread experiment when they had to do an independent research task, but putting the microbit in to be able to measure the variables made it, more of a fair test for the students, and added to the knowledge that you would gain from completing the experiment due to the data that you're collecting. So how much time do we have left?
We just got a few minutes here, Tanya, so if you had something else you wanted to share, but yeah.
On my screen it said that I had 23 minutes left, and I was like, wow, did I finish really quickly?
No, sorry. Yes, we've just got a couple more minutes before we pop into the closing session. So you definitely were in perfect timing. So Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, so this is something that you could use for all students. Yeah, so they definitely did test different types of bread. That was one of the first experiments that they completed. So one of our leaders actually lives right next to a bakery. So they went and grabbed different types of bread. They looked at making sure that the position that the bread was in was constant. They weren't sure whether light affected mold growth. So they placed their bread on the windowsill so that it was bright and sunny, and just left the microbit going, a single microbit, the whole experiment, so that they could see what the highest temperature got to, what the lowest temperature got to, and the light levels as well.
Excellent. Well, Tanya, we will let you carry on with the rest of your day, and hopefully, you and everyone here can join us in just a minute here over at the main stage for the closing session. Tanya, thank you so much for sharing the projects and the work and the code. Wonderful to see how science is being explored, and using you know the existing lessons and activities in new out of the box ways. I'm going to pull my soil moisture sensors out and see what's going on with my bread at home as well too. Excellent.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Talk to you soon.